Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today. Brought to you by AI Group.
Hello, I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from Yunganbar country, and this is the podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we're implementing the challenges of the 3Ds? You know them: digitalisation to keep up with your peers and your industries and to build efficiencies into your business; decarbonisation to meet your legal requirements and targets by 2050, and in some cases even earlier; and diversification to build sustainability into your business offerings and processes by reducing the dependence on a single relationship, whether that's a product, a technology, a supply chain, or an export market, the 3Ds. Today, let's again discuss decarbonisation of business and the economy. We need to understand that there's a lot going on and many people don't hear about it. We just don't know. So my guest today is a long-time friend of the pod. He's been on it many times. It's Michael Kilgariff. Hello, Michael. Welcome back.
James, thank you for having me back.
When we spoke last, you were putting your feet up and enjoying life post CEO of Rhodes Australia. You've had a long career as CEO in various industry organisations, and you put your feet up for a while, but I think you've put your feet back down again, haven't you? What are you doing?
Yes, indeed. So about 7 months ago, I took on the role of CEO of the Cement, Concrete and Aggregates Australia, which, as the name describes, represents all of those companies involved in the cement manufacturing, concrete distribution, quarrying, aggregates, sand, etc. So it's a big business and very, very fundamental to Australia's infrastructure and construction industry.
It sounds like you've learnt how to have that name roll off your tongue. Concrete, cement, and aggregates. Is that it?
Yeah. Cement, Concrete, and Aggregates Australia. It'd be true to say that. That's a name that I've rolled off a few times since I started. I mean, part of the reason I think that the board asked me to join the organisation was that they recognise that in today's environment where we're talking about a lot of the things that you just mentioned with supply chains, decarbonisation, etc., the organisation and the industry just needed to be a little bit more vocal and become an advocate for the industry. And be out there talking to government about the things that the industry would like to see.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I'm really keen to talk about what the industry is like and understand what's going on. It's relevant to everyone that's listening. You know, these fundamentals of our economy. But before we do, let's talk about leadership and management. Since I did some research and I see that you've released a strategy. Obviously, you had a bit to do with it, but as a team effort. You've been a CEO of a number of different organisations for a long time now. What's your thinking on strategic plans and how are they developed? What's important? Do you see sort of values being important, that kind of stuff? Just talk to me about how you view it when you say, okay, it's time to do a strategic plan.
Yeah, well, good question. And I've done a few now. And first of all, of course, it's important to make sure that your board is on the journey with you and that the objectives you see for the organisation are shared by the board and the broader membership. And look, you can do a deep dive in terms of surveying the members, or you can actually just do a select survey, if you like, stakeholder engagement process with the board. I was lucky when I started here is that the board had already done some of that thinking about where they wanted the organisation to go, and certainly advocacy and a focus around resource access and sustainability and decarbonisation was right up there. But it's interesting in that, for me, a strategic plan is something that really gives the organisation direction in terms of the things that we talk about, but more importantly, sometimes even the things that we don't talk about, because all organisations, be they one of our larger members or an industry association, which always tends to run pretty lean, we need to be able to basically utilise our resources in the best possible way to get the best outcome. So a strategic plan provides direction, but that's not to say that, in this industry, an apt way to describe it, that it's set in concrete. Things always change. Things always come at you.
How often do you say that? Yeah.
Things always change.
See how the concrete industry says it's not set in concrete. But things always change. How often do they change? I mean, in your industry, they'll be changing rapidly if you're looking about decarb and those sort of things.
Well, it is. I mean, even the discussion around net zero by 2050 a couple of years ago was probably not something that there seemed to be a lot of industry and government alignment on. Now, everybody is really focused on the idea that we have to be doing everything we can to achieve net zero by 2050, and it's become part of social license of a business to operate almost, in that businesses need to be engaged in this. And that gets back to advocacy as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that I'm a little surprised that you're blent into decarb so heavily. I would have thought that maybe you, the industry, were dragging your feet and saying, "Oh, it's too hard for us." But we'll talk about it in depth more shortly. But it's clear you haven't thought it was too hard, and now you have to lean into it.
Well, this is an industry. It's an international industry in that the supply chains for cement, clinker, etc., are truly international. But I mean, Australia, as part of a number of international organisations and movements, is very much part of the net zero by 2050 discussion. And so this is an industry that is very energy intensive, both in the production of cement, but also the emissions that are released when the manufacturing of cement process actually takes place. So we need to be on this journey, because otherwise discussions or decisions will be made about this industry for us rather than by us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think that's wise. Tell me about the organisation. Is it like one office in Canberra, or is there this membership offices around the country? Just talk a bit about what it looks like.
Yeah, well, we have a national office in Sydney, and I live in Melbourne, of course, which means that I basically get access to the members in both Melbourne and Sydney. But it's also an industry that's very heavily regulated at the state level. So we have state directors for every state who are responsible for really driving the discussion with our state committees, state government, state bureaucrats around a whole range of issues, not only around sustainability, but even planning issues to do with the development of new quarries. I mean, around Australia, it takes about 10 years for a new quarry to be approved and get up and running, which is a hell of a long time when you start to think about the planning that the companies have had to undertake, think about where they might be in 10 years' time.
Yeah. 10 years. Yeah, it can't be shortened. That's just the way it is.
Well, I'm always of the view that just because the way things are the way they are now doesn't mean that they can't be changed. And so, yes, that's certainly an objective of ours, to be able to shorten that time frame and give people certainty about what is going to be approved and what isn't. And that's a fairly important part of our strategy in terms of dealing with the government, but even at the federal government level, thinking about the Department of Infrastructure, how we get those sorts of issues onto the national agenda, part of the ministerial discussions that take place regularly. So that's, I guess, that dichotomy of state versus federal policy issues.
Yeah, it's an issue that AI Group knows very well, because
yes, sure.
we're the same issues. Going back to you as a leader, one of the great business brains, Cotter, I think it was, said culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah, and it's been accepted as a truism. I recently spoke to Karen Fuster on this podcast, and she said that she thought that strategy and culture should have breakfast together. That is two sides of the same coin. If you flick the coin into the air, both sides would have their moment in the sun in trying to work out. Tell me about your thoughts. How do you approach this? Do you start with culture and then go to strategy, or do you use your strategy to define your culture? What's your thinking?
Yeah, look, it is a really interesting proposition, actually. And look, I've taken over a couple of organisations where there's, a CEO has been in place for 10 years. The board really hasn't moved much, and a culture that, in my view, reflected maybe where the organisation had been in years previous rather than where they needed to be now. I've always been of the view that an organisation, an industry association in particular, needs to reflect the values of the industry that it represents. And so for me, yes, generally, I have embarked on strategy first because, in my view, if a culture needs to be changed, they need to, the organisation needs to know where it's going and why. The why bit can be a little bit challenging, but for me, a strategy is important because it sets the direction. But culture, of course, is where you actually start to implement the strategy. So you can't really have one happening too quickly over the other.
Yeah, so they should have breakfast together.
Yeah.
I quite like that.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that you've got in as an industry CEO is that you know your market very well. It's not like it's business to consumer type strategy. It's actually you've got to look after the people that pay you your wage. Is that difficult to get their feelings aligned? It must be at times different views within the membership.
Yeah, look, it's a discussion I have with other industry association CEOs quite often, actually, about how to align the views of an organisation where each member of that association is a fierce competitor and very, very mindful of not only their market positioning, but how they're also perceived by the market and also by government. So, look, it's a bit of a case of being able to basically run a business, understand a balance sheet, and know the difference. Basically, how do you derive revenue? But there's also a bit of diplomacy involved, also a bit of reading of the tea leaves, in that you might not be ever told explicitly that this is the direction the organisation needs to go in, but that's the role of the CEO, is to basically work out what that pathway is, if you like, to drive the organisation forward.
I noticed in your strategic plan you talk a lot about making sure that you're connected internationally. So, as you said before, this is an international industry. Where does Australia fit? Are we players in the industry? Are we as modern as other parts of the world? Or where do you think we fit?
Look, I think it depends on what industry you're talking about, but for the sake of this particular one, I think, yes, we are part of an international market, and we are certainly very, very keen to learn from our colleagues in international markets. But from my perspective, I think Australia does tend to lag behind a little bit in terms of innovation. A number of our members operate or are based in the European Union, and of course the European regulations that apply around this industry and the infrastructure industry generally are way ahead of where they are in Australia. So I think we're probably a bit too reluctant to pick up some of the innovations that are coming at us from the US and Europe. But the end of the day, yes, our climate might be a little bit different, but engineering principles don't change really from US to Europe to Australia. And so I think we just need to be a little bit more prepared to adapt and learn than we currently are from the in the international market.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, let's move on. We wanted to talk about decarbonisation. There is a key part of the decarbonisation question is hard-to-abate industries. These are the industries where it's hard to take carbon out of the operation. I imagine you're right there in the middle of that conversation. It's hard to do.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about this particular industry is that the focus has really been around energy. It's shifting a lot more to transport generally now. in that it's not only about the use of internal combustion engines of vehicles on our roads, but it's also about how those roads and bridges and rail networks constructed. And that's essentially where this industry comes into play, in that we are finding that increasingly the gaze of the policymakers, if you like, is turning towards the cement, concrete and aggregates industry. So we want to make sure that, when it comes to it, that we're still part of the debate. And in fact, in some ways, we're actually slightly ahead of where the government might be in terms of things it might want to do.
So we can get to a stage where concrete, etc., can be low carbon?
Well, it's essentially the way that cement can be made and the inputs into the industry. So, I mean, there's a whole range of things that can be done. Like, for example, the way that the way that cement is actually manufactured. If you're using renewable energy to drive that manufacturing process, we think that can derive about a 15% reduction. If we can think a little bit more about the way that we design our buildings and infrastructure, that can certainly also reduce the emissions. A lot of those concrete agitators that you see driving around the streets, if eventually they're all zero emissions vehicles, be it hydrogen or electric or biofuels, whatever it might be, those are the ways that we can actually reduce emissions in the industry.
Oh, I see. So it's not actually the production of the concrete that's the problem. Concrete itself is not necessarily a hard carbon product, such as steel. Steel is just impossible to figure out how to get rid of the carbon. Concrete's not quite the same? Well,
look, it is. I mean, it's still a very, very energy intensive industry, but essentially at its most fundamental, it's about turning limestone through a very high temperature process into cement. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. But fundamentally, that's effectively what you're doing.
Yeah, but it comes back down to this energy question, doesn't it? Isn't it interesting?
It does.
Yeah. And so what's the it sounds like the industry's got some real, well, you said the industry's got some real plans about this. And so talk me through that a bit more. So we've got the way it's transported from where it's made to where it's being used, plus also the way it's being created as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's about so you've got the actual production of cement, but it's also, there's the possibility of adding more limestone after the cement has been manufactured, which doesn't actually detract from the structural durability of the actual concrete. So it's about adding other material to the concrete mix. So we've got what we call cementitious materials like fly ash that basically comes out of the old coal-fired power stations, things like that. So you can actually add other materials in there that still preserve the structural or durability of the actual product. But from our perspective, it's also about things like taking a whole of life approach to the development of infrastructure when you're thinking about the carbon emissions from, say, a structure. It's about thinking about, okay, well, it's not about the upfront carbon emissions, it's about the carbon emissions over the entire life of the building or the bridge or whatever it might be. And so concrete in itself is a very low maintenance building material. So if you're looking at the carbon emissions over the life cycle of a bridge per se, then, quite often it's in fact lower. But then also at the end of that life, that product can also then be repurposed back into other concrete mix as an aggregate, or it can be used in road base, or it can be used in structures that don't actually require a heavy structural integrity. So we're bringing into the discussion here the circular economy or recycling of products. So theoretically, a concrete structure could have a life that stretches out over another 3 or 4 infrastructure projects.
Uses, yeah. Is that theoretical or is that like reasonable?
No, look, I think it's very reasonable. In fact, I think industry is actually quite far advanced ahead of where government regulations currently are. In our view, one of the things that actually stop industry from being more actively involved in the circular economy is government regulations preventing it. We have a bit of an issue in that our government leaders often are talking about the circular economy as they should be, but then when it comes down to, I guess, the nuts and bolts of how government actually operates in terms of regulating the industry, quite often those who have their hands on the levers of the codes and the guidelines that actually might apply very reluctant to do things differently to how they might have been doing them 40 years ago. And it's also about even the transporting of those products to a quarry or a recycling station so they can be mixed in with something else and sent on to another infrastructure project. So, yeah, it's in our view, the Productivity Commission at the moment has an inquiry into the circular economy, and we've been recommending that the government themselves needs to look at how they regulate the industry to allow that innovation to occur.
Yeah. Not many people think about circular economy every day, do they? It's not like something that comes into their mind, or they possibly should argue that as business people in the modern world, we should be thinking about maximising the resource of everything we have. I read somewhere once that they said there is more minerals above the ground than below the ground now. So, it's not going to be, we can't necessarily just keep excavating. We're going to have to start, repurposing. Interesting to hear your industries sort of taking that on. Yeah,
well, there's no shortage of, the raw products that go into making cement, but it's an expensive process to do it. Uh-huh. And so the more you can actually repurpose, concrete that's currently being used for one purpose and repurpose it into something else, the better off we're going to be from an economic and social perspective.
Yeah. Are you enjoying the job? Sounds like you are.
Yeah, look, it's an industry that on the face of it is basically, a very heavy industry that, it's basically a combination of mining, manufacturing, logistics and construction. So the touch points we have with government are actually quite significant. So, look, it's like anything. It's, got some really, really fascinating things that go on in the industry that maybe aren't apparent to even a lot of those people in the supply chain. Yeah, and so the opportunity to go out there and talk about the industry with people and explain how it works and I guess just shift people's gaze a little bit into the mechanics of how this industry works is, it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, we'll take a break and talk a bit more about that. What I'm encouraged to hear is that in these industries that are hard to abate, that are the big issues of the carbon economy, you're looking into it. You're leaning into decarbonisation because we hear from so many businesses saying, "Oh, it's not going to affect me. It's not going to happen. It's just something that the government's talking about." And part of my job is to say, no, it's actually happening. There's a lot of people working on this. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely right up at the front of that curve.
Good on you. Take a break. Yeah, before I do, I'll tell you a funny story. You and I were both in Northern Territory for a while. I was in a car driving through the top end with a person we both know. He was driving and he said, this bridge coming up, which is going across a crocodile infested river, I built that bridge. And I said, well, good on you. And we got halfway across the bridge and I said, bad time to ask, but are you a good engineer? And in the dry way the engineers talk, he said, oh, well, we'll find out when we get to the other side of the bridge, won't we? Yeah. Anyway, we did. So he must have been a reasonable engineer. We'll take a break. We'll be back in a sec.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying workers could result in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Michael, one of the things that you mentioned before was the circular economy, which leads me to think about standards. What's happening with standards in your organisation? Are they moving rapidly? Are they moving fast enough?
Look, standard. I mean, that's a very good question, because standards are something that this industry deals with every day. And to use, to copy an old ad from yesteryear, concrete ain't concrete. There's many, many different types of concrete, all governed by standards and regulations that apply at the national or even state level. So standards don't change quickly, and you probably wouldn't want there to be major radical change in a standard from year to year. But where you've got industry and government working together to try and amend a standard to adapt to something like net zero by 2050, change can be very, very slow, painfully slow, and unnecessarily slow in our view. So standards, not something that people talk about around the dinner table, but from an industry sustainability perspective, very, very, very important.
Well, here at AI Group, we do talk about it around the dinner table. Standards are important for us.
Yes.
Which leads on to the big issues of business today. As CEO, tell me about AI. Are you using AI in your business? Are you worried about it? Are you excited about it?
Yeah, look, we do use AI in our organisation, and I regard it, and this is how I refer to it as my team, is that AI is a bit like a new graduate or a young policy officer. You certainly wouldn't just take what you've been given and put it out to the membership as fact. It certainly requires checking, because AI is only really just using the information that it has access to, and sometimes, of course, it's rubbish in and rubbish out. But increasingly, as AI becomes more, I guess, omnipresent in terms of how industry works. I mean, you just think about AI in terms of, say, 5 years ago, where people were talking about it, and certainly those in the know knew it was coming. But for most of us, it was just something off in the distance. Whereas now it's become part of a business tool. And I regard it as a bit like in the yesteryear, students used to use slide rules in terms of being able to use to do mathematical calculations. Now, when we moved from slide rules to calculators, the big fear was, of course, is that nobody would actually know anything about maths anymore, because all they needed to do was use a calculator. Well, I guess in my view, why do most people need to know the intricacies of why it is that they're actually doing something, when they can actually be thinking about how to use it for change, or how to evolve things. So AI, in my view, it's definitely going to be a game changer in this industry, because increasingly you'll be able to use it to come up with different products, to test the durability of particular cement and concrete products. It's just going to be a complete game changer from an infrastructure perspective.
And there's no doubt your members would be well ahead with AI, because they're all in engineering type businesses, so they'd be really right. They're on the edge of technology. Where do you see the industry in 5 years or in 10 years' time? Do you think some of these things we've been talking about, the circular economy, the new standards, greater technology, lower fuel emissions, where are we going to be in 10 years?
Yeah, look.
Pick a number. I mean, I don't know, 10 years.
That's a really...
10 years in those 2034. So 2035, we're right in the middle of decarbonisation target zone. Where's the industry going to be?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think to achieve some of the policy objectives that governments have actually set for the economy, probably the technology doesn't even exist at the moment to realise that. No. And there's a bit of a saying that, when you think about the short term and the longer term things always happen a little bit quicker than we think in the longer term, but never as quick when we think about the short term. So, look, where will we be? I wish I was one of those futurists that could give you a explanation as to where we're going to be in 10 years' time, but I think certainly AI is going to be a part of it. I think it is possible that the economy will achieve its net zero by 2050 objectives, but I suspect that there's a lot of technology that needs to be developed that isn't currently available.
So the answer is going to be via better technology, largely?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an engineer or a scientist, but I have great faith in engineers and scientists to be able to solve pretty big problems. I mean, just as another example, when you think about connected and automated vehicles, not that many years ago, we were all going to be driving around in connected and automated vehicles by now, but of course that hasn't happened. But what we are doing increasingly is driving around in electric vehicles. So over time, I'm pretty sure that the connected and automated vehicles will be a reality, but it hasn't happened as quickly as we thought it might.
I think it'll be one of those things that it takes a long time to get here, and then all of a sudden it's here. It happens. Yeah. Mm. And that's going to happen in many different ways as we head into in 10 years' time. As I say, we're in the middle of the decarbonisation targets by then. It's been good talking to you. I appreciate you sharing the insights of your industry, because I think people listening to this will be interested to know just how heavily you have lent into the decarbonisation as a key part, circular economy, all new standards, things that they perhaps aren't thinking about as rapidly as they should. But if you guys are doing it, well, then everyone should be doing it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that need to happen to make all of that work. And of course, as I've said a couple of times during this conversation, it does require a collaborative partnership between industry and government in terms of the regulations that apply and what the industry needs to do to achieve those objectives.
And will keep you busy for the next couple of years, Michael.
Yeah, I'd say so. Thanks, James, and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Look forward to it, as always. Well, that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. That's it for this year. Thank you for listening and for your feedback. If you have any feedback on today's interview with Michael or ideas for the show, or just want to give me some feedback, hit me up at james.scotland@aigroup.com.au or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back next year with more insights into how to improve your business through managing the 3Ds. It's been a pleasure talking to you all year. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.